We've been discussing the difficulty of the RSA crypto system, meaning how hard is it for an adversary to invert. And we had seen that there's a lot of work on factoring, and various factoring challenges had been posed and solved. And from that we were getting some indication that at least for hard enough numbers, people don't know how to factor fast. That story took another turn with Shor's algorithm, which said that if quantum computers exist, then in fact factoring is easy. And that's been an important evolution in our understanding of factoring and RSA. And when Shor first did his algorithm in the early 90s, there wasn't really any sort of semblance of a quantum computer around. You can see this more recent article, which is a little extreme, but in their viewpoint, the algorithm was created in the early 90s, and now technology is catching up in the sense that they believe quantum computers are close to arriving that could run this algorithm, and that would guarantee the end of RSA encryption. That's something of some worry, like why are we using it and relying on it for daily communication across the internet if it's such a threat. This is something people are looking at in the community. The prognosis for quantum computing is not quite as clear as this article might indicate, nor is it something everyone agrees upon. So here's a contrary view from Ron Rivest, who's, as you know, is one of the inventors of RSA. And he was speaking at the RSA conference, and he says, I give fusion power a higher chance of succeeding than quantum computing. So indeed, if he doesn't think that the current quantum computing technology is, in fact, really going to become practical to the point of breaking RSA, you can go and see where that technology is. For example, someone here is asking, well, how well have they done? If you're actually, what is the biggest integer you can actually factor with Shor's algorithm on a real quantum computer that's actually been built? And the answers here are, interesting. What this person says is, here's the biggest thing they seem to have been able to factor, which is, something you could do by hand. It's teeny. So if this is as much as you can do, quantum computers are not going to be a threat. And furthermore, he refers to these things as stunts anyway. On the other hand, the government is taking this pretty seriously. So they're thinking that even if quantum computers are 20, 30 years out, we better get prepared. And they have a research program now to standardize what's called post-quantum cryptography, new algorithms that are resistant to attackers equipped with quantum computers. So all that is fun stuff that's happening. But meanwhile, RSA is still very much with us and still very interesting. So with those basics of RSA covered, what we now want to move on to is how do you encrypt with RSA? Now that at first might seem like a tautological question because, well, isn't that exactly what we've done? RSA is encryption, isn't it? Well, it is, but not a very secure one. So if we turn RSA into an encryption scheme in the most direct way, we get what's called plain RSA encryption. Remember, an encryption scheme has a particular syntax, as we studied at the start of this chapter. It's a triple of algorithms: key generation, encryption, decryption, and you have to say how all of them work. So if I want to define an encryption scheme based on the RSA function, the way I would do it is I would first fix a RSA generator. Remember, this is the algorithm that if you run it, produces all the numbers you want, the modulus, the primes that factor the modulus, the encryption and decryption exponents. And the scheme is associated to that generator. How does it generate keys? Having run the generator, it lets the public key be the modulus and encryption exponent, and it lets the secret key be the modulus and decryption exponent. Really just the decryption exponent, but for convenience we put this in the sense that, because even though this isn't really secret, and those are returned. Now we know that when you want to encrypt, you have this public key, and when you want to decrypt, you have the secret key. So how does encryption with the public key work? You give it a message M, And here for simplicity, we assume the message is in ZN star. So if you have messages of some other type, they would have to be encoded as integers in ZN star. You simply raise that message to the eth power mod n using our mod exp algorithm, and that's the ciphertext you return. How do you decrypt that ciphertext? That's exactly the RSA property. Raise it to the dth power mod n, and you get back m. So we're done. This is a public key encryption scheme. Syntactically, it's perfectly correct. The decryption correctness is exactly the RSA property. The difficulty, though, is that when you come to security, things are not quite as nice. Now, historically, the way they looked at this is they said, well, the main goal of an attacker would be to recover the secret key from the public key, and that, it appears, as we've seen, requires factoring in. So that should mean it's secure. But our security metric is much more stringent. It's IND-CPA. And we know that no deterministic encryption method will ever provide IND-CPA. So we have a very clear attack against plain RSA from the IND-CPA perspective. You can easily break its IND-CPA security just from the mere fact that it's deterministic. And this exercise asks you to do that, to actually just take the trouble to write down that attack, because it's instructing to see how it works. Now we'll move on to go beyond that. And the interesting problem here is, well, before that, there's another exercise which asks you to further play with an RSA variant, build some algorithms and give some attacks and stuff like that. So we're now going to move on to seeing how RSA lends itself to encryption that's IND-CPA. That means that we won't use it directly, but we'll still use it very crucially, and we'll get more secure encryption than sort of native RSA would provide. But before we do the technical part, there may be a historical comment that's worth making. We present this as a kind of evolution in which we started with the definition of IND-CPA and then looked at RSA. But historically, it was the other way around. RSA came first. And it was exactly by looking at the weaknesses in RSA that we just saw, namely it's deterministic, that people came up with ideas like IND-CPA as a goal. So it played a role in motivating and creating the theory as well. Anyway, so I'm now going to describe a scheme which is RSA based, but not plain RSA, and it accomplishes encryption that's IND-CPA secure. We know the main element you need from this scheme is randomization. So somewhere it has to use randomization. How does it work? If I have to encrypt the message, the keys are RSA keys. So the public key is the modulus n and encryption exponent d. How does it work? It doesn't raise the message to the eth power. Instead, it picks a random point x in Zn star and raises that to the eth power mod n to get something it calls C sub a. Okay, so far that hasn't encrypted the message at all because the message isn't even involved. What we now do is we hash this x value, the one over here, and we get something we call k, which we view as a symmetric key. This hash function is some public function that takes group elements to strings, let's say strings of some length little k. Finally, we add the message by bitwise XOR to this key and get a second ciphertext component. And the full ciphertext is this, the asymmetric component, and this, which we call the symmetric component. What this accomplishes is effectively, we think of little x as a symmetric key that's being transferred from the encryptor to the receiver through this ciphertext. That shows up in decryption when you have to decrypt this pair, which is the full ciphertext under the secret key. The secret key gives you the decryption exponent for RSA. That allows you from this, by raising it to the dth power mod n, to recover the x inside here because that's exactly RSA inversion. Once you have the x, since the hash function is public, you can compute k. And then since you have c sub s, you reverse this and get m as cs plus k. So this, it turns out, is good. You can see the randomization step here, and it turns out that it's done well enough that INDCPA actually holds. So here are the details, and if you have to write the scheme algorithms in the proper syntax, you have to write all three of them. Formally, the scheme is associated to a generator. SRSA stands for simple RSA. There's a public hash function as well, returning strings of some length little k, which is the message length of the scheme. Key generation runs the RSA generator to get those 5 numbers, and then the key setup is exactly the same as in plain RSA. The public key is the modulus and encryption exponent, secret key is modulus and decryption exponent, and those are the keys returned. Encryption takes the public key, which is N and E, and then it takes the message M to encrypt. The message M is no longer a group element, it's a string of length k. And then it does what we saw on the last slide. You pick a random x from Zn star, hash it to get k, a symmetric key, and then you create this asymmetric ciphertext raising little x to the eth power mod n to get a group element. This is simply apply the RSA function to little x. Also, you add this key here to the message to mask it and get this symmetric ciphertext. And the ciphertext for SRSA is the pair. When decryption gets that pair, it wants to recover M. For that, it needs K. How is it going to get K? Well, it's hash of X, so it needs to get X. How does it get X? By taking this C sub A, which is X to the power E, and doing RSA decryption. We know that that will reverse the encryption and get back little x. And then you can run through the rest and you get back the message. So this is a solid, good scheme to use. And it turns out there's a theorem saying it's fine. It's at use INDCPA. It says that you have to assume one-wayness of the generator. And from a theoretical perspective, you have to assume the hash function is perfect, what we call a random oracle. Like I said, not something we'll actually define or pursue formally in this class. In practice, you obtain the hash of k by some method like this. Take a hash function like SHA-256 and apply it to k, except to get more than 256 bits out as the native hash function would give you, you might apply it to small perturbations of k a bunch of times and concatenate the results until you have enough bits. This scheme is good from the point of view of security, but from the performance perspective, it has one element that people were a little bit unhappy about, which is that even if your message is very short, you start increasing ciphertext length. So if you look at the scheme, the ciphertext consists of one group element plus something which has the same length as the message. What this other scheme does is it says that as long as the message isn't too big, I don't have that extra overhead. Somehow the message is embedded back into the group element. And this scheme called OAEP has turned out to be pretty popular and well used as well. And it also has proofs of security. The keys for it are the same. The usual RSA keys, the public keys is the modulus and encryption exponent, secret key is the modulus decryption exponent, and I'm illustrating here in the case of a 1024-bit modulus. It will use not one but two hash functions. The first is a function that's actually expanding. It takes a 128-bit string and returns an 894-bit string, and the other H is the other way around. It takes 894 bits down to 128. When I want to encrypt a message M, I'm going to assume its length is at most this much. And then the ciphertext is going to be just a 1024-bit string, so that's the extra compactness we've achieved. Of course, it better be randomized. We won't get INDCPA otherwise. starts by picking a random 128-bit string, and now write it down here. Here, write down the message, but put some redundancy, some zeros in front. And here, pad it out until you get a string of length 894, so that this together fits in 1024 bits. This says it's a mandatory one and as many zeros as you need to bring the length up to what you want. And now there's a kind of DES Feistel-like structure. Take R, apply the function G, XOR this entire thing into it, apply H to the result, XOR R now back into that and get S and T. This is some 1024-bit string. Now notice that so far we have no security whatsoever. G and H are public functions, and this structure is easily reversible. If I gave you X, which is S and T, you would very easily recover M. So the security is going to come from RSA. What you do is you now apply RSA to X by raising it to the eth power mod n, and that's the ciphertext that's returned. How do you decrypt? When you get the ciphertext, the first thing you do is reverse RSA encryption. So you raise the ciphertext to the dth power, which you have in the secret key, and get back the X. You parse X into its two halves, S and T. And now remember that just as DES decryption holds, the Feistel structure is reversible. Right? So from S and T, you can maybe see it here, you can get back these two things. How? By running T through H, adding that to S to get R, running R through G, and adding that to T to get this stuff over here. And so we see that over here. So you run T through H, add to S to get R, run this through G, add that to T and get here. Now, when you come here, you parse what you get into three components. The first one, 28 bits, and then here you remove the padding, and M is whatever is left. But there's an important check here. You could at this point simply return M as the message, but you don't. You instead check that the redundancy is present. If this is really all zeros, then you return M, and otherwise you don't. And this allows you to obtain security against chosen ciphertext attacks. That's not something we're studying here, but that's kind of the real main goal of public key encryption. So RSA OEP is widely used. It's in some versions of TLS after some point. It's in SSH, and it's a whole bunch of standards. PKCS is the main standard of RSA Corporation, which percolates into RFCs and many other things. Then there's IEEE standards, international standards, and many other things. Okay, then here we have a bunch of exercises. Maybe we'll assign these at some point, so I won't go through them here. So something to take away from this is that if you are in a position to be using public key encryption in practice, you'd like to be able to look at this stuff and say what is safe to use and what isn't. And that's kind of the very highest level takeaway, and it's good to remember. And the bottom line is plain RSA is not really a safe tool, but the other things we've studied are. We can see a little bit about how standards reflect all this. So this, for example, is the PKC standard inside an RFC. And it shows you all the different ways all this shows up in the standards, the different encryption and decryption operations and so forth. So it's nice to see how the schemes we have here are rendered in the context of a standard. And it covers both encryption and signatures. We'll get to signatures later. But if you go down far enough somewhere in the standard, here you see this picture, and this picture should hopefully look familiar. You see that this is actually OEP. So one of the standards used in there, they call it OEP encoding, is exactly what we've just looked at.